Hey everyone, it's Matt, and today I'll be talking to you about all the video games that I played in 2023. At least all the video games I played a significant amount of, because there were quite a few games that I only played for a few minutes just to try out or didn't really get far in, so I'll be limiting this to the games that I played several hours or more of, or if they're short games that I played a majority of them or all of them. So, without any further ado, let's get into my thoughts on all these games. First, we have Danganronpa V3 Killing Harmony, which is the third game on this compilation here, Danganronpa Decadence for the Switch. And I like this game a lot. Obviously, I'm not going to recommend it to anyone who hasn't played the other Danganronpa games, but if you're not familiar with the series, it is basically a sort of murder mystery where you are a high schooler locked inside a high school by a maniacal robot teddy bear and forced to, either kill your classmates or try to survive being killed by your other classmates who have to try and kill without being caught. And so you go through the game talking with a bunch of other high schoolers, and every so often one of them dies, and you have to try and figure out who did it. And if you can, you get to continue the game. And if you don't, everyone dies. But I'm getting a bit too much into the story here. This is the third game in the series, and I think it is my favorite. I do have a soft spot for the first because it has a kind of a weird vibe to it that's unlike the others, but the third one definitely has the most interesting story with the most complex plot twists and ups and downs and lots of just thrilling, unexpected moments. It is a little bit long. It's a lot longer than the other games in the series, and the ending is pretty divisive. A lot of people don't like it, but I like it, and I think I understand what it was going for, so I'm not going to get into spoilers or anything, but if you like murder mystery type games like Phoenix Wright and things like that, it's a bit like Phoenix Wright, but edgier and with some more gameplay components to it. And yeah, if that sounds interesting to you, I would recommend checking out the Danganronpa series. Pretty good games. Next up, I played Pizza Tower, which is a game that I actually did a video on last year on this channel because I liked it so much. And it was one of my favorite games of 2023. If you're not familiar with Pizza Tower, it is a side-scrolling platformer, 2D platformer, that is definitely inspired by the Mario Land games, if you are familiar at all with those. And it's just really fast-paced Mario Land in a way, but with an art style that feels like pixel art versions of old 90s cartoons, like the stuff on Nickelodeon. And it also has a fantastic soundtrack, just really catchy, addictive music. And the whole game is so fast-paced and stylish, and it just comes together into this whole package of just, I call it a huge, very funny adrenaline rush, if that makes sense. It's got a lot of humor, but it's also very thrilling and just super satisfying to play. And so if you like 2D platformers and you haven't checked out Pizza Tower, I would absolutely recommend it 100%. I loved it. Next up was Dead Space, the new remake of the original game. And this is another one I made a video on great as well. I always loved the original Dead Space, the one that came out back in, I think, 2008. I thought it had a great atmosphere and was a very, I guess, it felt like Resident Evil in space, or Resident Evil 4 specifically in space. Really just an action-packed survival horror. But seeing as I like sci-fi themes and settings, I liked it maybe even more than RE4. Probably not because RE4 is so good, but it was pretty close, and so I'm glad to say that Dead Space, the remake, is just about as good, if not better, than the original version. It has the same fantastic atmosphere, really nice graphics, and lots of scary monsters and horror stuff going on in it. So if you're a fan of survival horror or just sci-fi action in general, I absolutely recommend Dead Space, either the original or the new one. Though I would recommend the new one if you have a console or a PC that can play it, because it is better than the original in my opinion. Next up was Metroid Prime Remastered. And speaking of old sci-fi games that were fantastic and got fantastic remastered or remade versions, this is an incredible game. Metroid Prime is one of my favorite games of all time. I was obsessed with it back when it first came out in the early 2000s. And though I wish they had come out with a whole remastered trilogy, this is better than nothing. It's just a really great, unique first-person adventure game / shooter. It's the only, well, not the only, one of the only games I've played that manages to capture the kind of Metroidvania feeling in a 3D space without really losing what makes a Metroidvania a Metroidvania. It's got great exploration and just a real sense of progression as you explore and find new power-ups and unlock new areas. And it has a really unique theme as well. I've always loved the Metroid games, their brand of sci-fi with their crazy critters and creatures and what have you. And yeah, if you've never played Metroid Prime, this is the way to do it. It's a fantastic remaster, and it's available on a modern console now. Great game, Metroid Prime Remastered. Next up was Pico Park. And Pico Park is a very simple 2D platformer meant to be played with friends. And I did play this online with some internet friends a while back. And it's one of those games where teamwork is what matters. And part of the fun comes from not cooperating with your teammates and basically just trolling each other for hours and hours. And so this is one of those games that brings you closer together with your friends while also driving you apart. So if you like 2D platformers and games that you can have a good and a bad time with friends, I would definitely recommend Pico Park. It's nothing amazing or anything, but it is a very fun time, and it's very cheap, if I remember correctly. So yeah, if that's your kind of thing, Pico Park is a good time. And next up was the longest game I've ever beaten, at around 100 hours. And it's also probably my favorite game that I played last year. And that was Persona 5 Royal, which is the sort of definitive edition, complete edition, I guess, of Persona 5, which already had incredible reviews, but this is even better, and I can confirm that because a few years back I played maybe 20 hours of Persona 5, and I liked it a lot, but kind of just got distracted from it at some point. But this time including the new content for the Royal version. And it was a fantastic experience all the way through, and I'd recommend it to anyone with even a slight interest in JRPGs. And I say that because historically I've not really been much of a fan of JRPGs. I get kind of bored of turn-based combat. It feels very repetitive to me, but this game has enough variety to it and enough depth to the combat and enough other gameplay systems like the social simulation and the great story that it makes it worth it. And there are so many little features to make the combat more smooth and fast-paced that a lot of other games I've played don't have. And so it kind of takes all the little boring bits of a JRPG out and maximizes all the best parts for 100 hours straight with a really interesting story and great characters and fantastic music. So yeah, there's not much else I can really say about it. It is a fantastic game, and I'd recommend it to pretty much anyone. Great game. And next was a little game called Slayers X Terminal Aftermath Vengeance of the Slayer, misspelled as Vengance. Now, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I don't blame you. It's not exactly a very well-known game, but to those of you who may be familiar with Hypnospace Outlaw, a game I did a video on a few years ago, this game is related to it. In Hypnospace Outlaw, the sort of alternate reality 90s internet simulator game, there is someone with a website whose name is Zane. He's a teenage edgelord, and he's very unintentionally funny because of how edgy and try-hard he is and how much he's trying to be cool. But the backstory for the Slayers X game is that Zane, in his teenage years, started developing an FPS game like Doom or Duke Nukem, but never finished it. But one day, he found the files and decided to finish the game this year or last year, back in 2023. And so what this is a spin-off of Hypnospace Outlaw, where you're playing the boomer shooter made by the teenage edgelord in that game. And it is, for those of you familiar with Hypnospace at least, glorious. It has everything that makes a boomer shooter fun, just running around shooting things at high speed and finding little secrets. But also, it is very funny and has lots of references for fans of Hypnospace Outlaw. And what's interesting about it too is it has a very unique sort of setting and vibe to it. Unlike any other shooter or video game at all that I've played, it is set in late 90s, early 2000s, kind of middle America suburbia. So you're going around, just little city streets and stores like, not quite Walmart, but maybe convenience stores, and I don't know how to really give good examples of it, but when you're playing it, you think to yourself, oh yes, I am definitely running around a neighborhood in Iowa in 2001 or something like that. And it's just got such a unique vibe to it that makes it special, which is on top of the fact that it's very funny and also fun because it's a decently made boomer shooter. I probably wouldn't recommend it to anyone who hasn't played Hypnospace Outlaw, but I would highly recommend that you play Hypnospace Outlaw anyway, so go play that if you haven't, and then go play Slayers X. Great time. So next up, I played a game that many called their favorite game of 2023, The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. And I'm going to up front here and say, I personally do not agree. Now don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a bad game, but it is not a game for me, I don't think, unfortunately. Even though I did like Breath of the Wild, but let me explain. To me, Breath of the Wild was a very good game that took the Zelda formula and tried to kind of transplant it into an open world game. And I thought it was very fun to explore. It had interesting locations to look around. I liked some parts of the combat and puzzles and so on, but it also had some things I didn't like about it. Certain things that felt very tedious, like the weapons breaking after only a few hits, and certain things where you had to just navigate too many menus to get things done, where it felt like there could have been a simpler solution. But for the most part, it was pretty straightforward, and it didn't really get too complicated, so those annoyances were relatively minor. But for me, Tears of the Kingdom feels like it takes Breath of the Wild. Doesn't really add that much that was interesting to me. And instead takes all the annoyances I had about Breath of the Wild and cranks them up to 11. Let me explain what I mean, though. In Breath of the Wild, your weapons breaking was a bit of an annoyance, but it was easy enough to just kind of ignore because you would always be able to flip over to the next weapon in your inventory in half a second and just be on your way. But in this game, there's the new fusion system where you're encouraged to fuse things together, particularly fusing items to your weapons to make them more powerful, to give yourself a fighting chance against many enemies. And because of that, every time a weapon breaks, you not only have to choose a new weapon, but you have to sort through an often overly complex and overfilled inventory full of random parts and fuse one of them to the weapon. So it's a multi-step process every few minutes, or every few seconds even, if you're not lucky, to just keep making new weapons and fusing things together, and it feels like you're constantly in menus in this game, instead of just exploring the world. There are so many new abilities and cool physics, toys and options and things like that, but to me they felt more frustrating than fun, because instead of the game just letting me explore and do my thing and really just get immersed in the world, it felt like I'd take 5 steps, have an idea for something to do, and then have to sort through 5 menu options just to do what I wanted to do, and then do another 5 menu options 10 seconds later. And maybe I'm exaggerating a bit. I haven't played it in a few months, so I might be misremembering just how bad that aspect is, but to me the tedium of all the overly complicated gameplay systems and menus I had to navigate just really wore me down and made the game feel unfun to me, which is a shame, because I can tell there is a great game and a really cool world to explore under all those little annoyances that kind of drove me away. But what I want to do is run around the world and explore and fight things. I don't want to press several buttons in a row to navigate menus where things are not really easily sorted in intuitive ways, or weapons that are laid out in a single row line instead of a grid or weapon wheel. I mean, I think you get the idea. I could rant about this for a while, but I was just disappointed that to me it felt more tedious than fun. I might go back to it at some point to see if I change my mind, if I'm in a different mood later down the line, because I do want to enjoy this game, but to me it was just very disappointing in that aspect. No judgment, of course, if you like this game. I know a lot of people love it, and I think that's great. Please continue loving it, but just wasn't for me, really. Unfortunate. Next up was Persona 4 Golden, which is, of course, the game that came before Persona 5 Royal. And I like this game a lot. I've not finished it yet. I did put it down a while back and haven't gotten back to it, but in a lot of ways it's just more Persona. But unfortunately for me, I feel like Persona 5 Royal spoiled me a bit, because that game has such a flow to it, with so many quality of life features and extra production value and style, so that Persona 4 Golden to me felt like a bit too much of a step back, and I found myself getting a little bored, feeling like it was a bit more repetitive without as much of the stuff I liked. But it is a good game, and I'd like to get back to it at some point. I just kind of fell off it after 10-15 hours. If you like JRPGs, it's certainly a very good one, and it has fantastic reviews for a reason, but I feel like Persona 5 Royal is the better game and more accessible. And if you plan on playing multiple Persona games, maybe start with Persona 4 Golden, so Persona 5 doesn't spoil it for you. But yeah, pretty good game, just I played the games in the wrong order, unfortunately. I'll probably get back to it at some point, though. Next was a game called Neon White. And Neon White is a very, very fun, thrilling game. It is a sort of first-person shooter slash platformer slash speedrunning game hybrid with a slight card game element. Very slight. The cards don't really matter because they just determine how many times you can do specific moves and attacks, and they don't really change per level, but still there are cards, so I decided I would mention it. But in this game, you go through very short levels, trying to get to the end as fast as possible while jumping and shooting and just doing cool, stylish moves with a fantastic soundtrack by Machine Girl. And in a way, this game feels a bit like Hotline Miami to me, if you know that game, where the levels are very short. You only have a few seconds to really get things right, and you can just instantly restart without any penalty if you don't do things how you want to. And it's a game where you just want to keep doing the same thing over and over again until you get it perfect. And it's challenging, though it's not as challenging as something like Hotline Miami, but the challenge comes more from you wanting to get the best time you can than actually trying to finish the level. Finishing the levels is usually pretty easy. Getting the best score is not, but it's a very addictive and fun, fast-paced game, and if you like skill-based challenges and platforming and shooting, I would highly recommend Neon White. It's a really great game. Next, I played We Love Katamari REROLL plus Royal Reverie, which is a remastered version of We Love Katamari, which I believe was the second Katamari Damacy game. And if you're familiar with Katamari Damacy, you know exactly what you're getting here. You're a guy rolling around a ball and sticking things onto the ball, and the ball gets bigger and bigger, and you roll up bigger and bigger items, and eventually you're rolling up half the world, or even half the universe. And it's a simple but very fun time. A very arcadey type of game where you try and get the best score in the time limit, or complete various objectives in a few minutes. And it's very easy to learn, but difficult to master. And it has a very quirky style to it that's very fun and often funny. So, if that sounds like your kind of thing and you haven't played a Katamari Damacy game, I would highly recommend any of the Katamari Damacy games, at least the ones I've played. They're all great. A very fun time. Next up, I played Signalis, which is a sort of retro pixel art style survival horror sci-fi game in the vein of old games like Resident Evil. It In it, you explore a sort of decaying, maybe abandoned facility, and there are lots of spooky creatures and puzzles to solve, and you have to try and survive on a limited amount of ammo while roaming around and unlocking doors and finding items. It very much feels like a top-down Resident Evil game, one of the early Resident Evil games. And it tries so hard to emulate the old Resident Evil style of survival horror that it brings, along with the good stuff, some more frustrating stuff, unfortunately. Like very limited ammo, and most importantly, a very, very, very limited inventory. There are many items in this game, but you have so few inventory spots, including the spaces taken up by equipped items and weapons, that I felt like I spent more time in this game backtracking to storage boxes and then back to where I was trying to go than actually trying to play the rest of the game at times. And it's unfortunate because otherwise I generally like the game a lot. It does occasionally get tedious otherwise, but it's mostly interesting to explore and very tense and thrilling at times, but I feel like the limited inventory size severely harms the fun of the game. It's, based on my limited memory of the old Resident Evil games, even more limited than those old games. And while I understand it was a design choice, it is a design choice that I do not like. So I think I got most of the way through this game, but then eventually just got so frustrated with the endless backtracking that I just decided to drop it. But I might go back to it at some point because I was enjoying it. I just got very impatient with it towards the end. So if you think you can stand the limited inventory size and you like that kind of game, I would still recommend at least giving it a try, because it is a well-made game in most ways. Pretty good game. Next up, I played Pikmin 4. And Pikmin 4 is a fantastic game. I loved Pikmin 4. I've always enjoyed the Pikmin games. They're a very fun and unique series where you command armies of cute little creatures to solve puzzles and carry things around and battle enemies. But this game has, I think, the most content. Maybe, I think so. It has the most polish. It has a lot more complexity and variety to it. And it really just feels like the ultimate version of Pikmin in a lot of ways. And so, if you like Pikmin, you absolutely must play Pikmin 4. And if you don't like Pikmin, I think it's a good place to start. It doesn't have many of the old frustrations of the old games, and it's just a great time, and it really does a good job of easing you into it, even if you don't really know how Pikmin works. So, yeah, highly recommended. Pikmin 4. Next was Powerslave Exhumed, which is a remaster of an old FPS that I think was on the Sega Saturn, if I'm not mistaken. And there was also a version on, I think, PlayStation, but this remaster is based on the Saturn version because it had a different level layout and gameplay system. But Powerslave Exhumed is an old retro FPS game, kind of an adventure game as well. In a lot of ways it feels like an early prototype for a Metroid Prime type of game where you're exploring and backtracking and unlocking new items to get to new areas, but at its core it is very much a boomer shooter in a way. One of those old games like Doom or Duke Nukem where you're running around and shooting things, but in this case with more complex interlocked level design and power-ups you can unlock to unlock more areas. And it's a very fun game, occasionally a little unclear what you're supposed to do, and so I felt like I had to use a guide at times. But if you can get beyond that and you like exploring and shooting things, I would definitely recommend Powerslave Exhumed. It's a fun time, pretty good game. Next, I played Brotato, which is, I don't know if I'd call it a Vampire Survivors-like, or what the actual genre should be called, but it is a game somewhat like Vampire Survivors, where you are locked into an arena with a bunch of enemies coming at you, and you gradually acquire more weapons and power-ups to destroy them faster and try and survive. Though, unlike Vampire Survivors, it has a bit more complexity with what you can unlock. There are more types of stats to try and minimize and maximize as you choose items. And it's basically Vampire Survivors with more thinking and more of a limit to how long you can play. But it is very fun, and if you like Vampire Survivors, I definitely recommend giving it a try. I do personally still prefer Vampire Survivors just because I like turning my brain off with that game, and you can't quite do that as much with Brotato, but if you wish Vampire Survivors had more complexity and more content, Brotato is a fine option for sure. I liked it a lot. Next, I played Armored Core 6, Fires of Rubicon. And this is my first Armored Core game, but if you're familiar with me, you know it is not my first From Software game. So I was very excited to try this out, especially after hearing that it was taking influence from the Souls games and Sekiro a bit. And indeed, it does feel a bit like those, but it is pretty different as well. It's a game that is, at its core, an action game, like the Souls games and Sekiro, where you have very challenging enemies to defend yourself against. And oftentimes you'll run into bosses that take many, many attempts to get good enough to beat. But it adds a layer of mech building onto it, where you have many different parts to put together to try and create mechs that are fast, lightweight, powerful, heavy, what have you. And in a way, it makes it interesting because you have so many different approaches. But in another way, it makes the game, to me, feel very unbalanced when it comes to challenge, because most levels in the game feel like you can just destroy anything in half a second with any build, and you just breeze right through. And then occasionally you'll run into a level or a boss fight that feels borderline impossible unless you have the perfect combination of parts. And what parts you need might not be obvious, at least they weren't to me. And so it was a game where I felt like I was having a good time, and then occasionally I'd run into these giant walls in my path, and I felt like I was bashing my head against a wall trying to figure out what parts were optimal. And while I understand that's kind of the point of a mech building game, it's not something I'm too familiar with or fond of personally. And so I did find myself getting frustrated at times, thinking to myself, why can't I just get good enough with my build that I love already to beat this boss? And I suppose if I had gotten extraordinarily good, I could have maybe done it, but it felt like more frustration than it was worth. So I'd end up just building the overpowered build I found online or something, and cheese my way through it. But that wasn't very satisfying. So, I don't know. And I guess one more thought adding to that, unlike most of the Souls games, it felt like there were so many attacks coming at you at all times in certain levels that it was often impossible to avoid every single thing hitting you, which is fine, but it also felt like battles became more a war of attrition than something about skill, and it's not something I like quite as much. But of course there are people out there doing crazy runs where they're getting hit by none of the trillions of missiles coming at them at once from 360 degrees, but I'm not quite that skilled, and I don't have the time or patience to get that skilled, despite having beaten all the other Souls games without too much difficulty. But I guess I'm just kind of ranting at this point about not being good enough, but it is a fair way of reviewing the game, I think. If you go into it with the wrong mindset or don't know what to expect, it might be very frustrating. But overall, I thought it was a pretty good time, and I did like it. So yeah, would recommend for fans of mech games or Souls-likes. Next, I played the Callisto Protocol, which is a survival horror game in space, a lot like Dead Space, made by, I think, the original creator of Dead Space, if I'm not mistaken. And in many ways, it's definitely trying to be a spiritual successor to Dead Space, but it does have some differences, and this is a game that, upon release, got very bad reviews from many people. A lot of people hated it, and it can be kind of a running joke from what I saw in the video game industry. So I went into it with low expectations, but I did want to try it because I am a fan of Dead Space and games like these. And personally, I thought it was enjoyable. It's not a fantastic game, but if you go in with low expectations, it's a pretty fun time, and it has fantastic looking graphics as well. In a way, it's a game that feels more like they were trying to make a cool sci-fi horror movie than a video game. The gameplay is very simple and basic and repetitive, but I liked the vibe enough, and I thought it was just engaging and fast-paced enough to not really overstay its welcome. And yeah, I mean, I could complain about it, but enough people have already complained about it out there. Yeah, it's simple. Yeah, the combat's kind of clunky, and the story is kind of bad with an abrupt ending that doesn't really satisfy you. But if you like just the experience of exploring a space station with, well, not a space station, a prison on the moon, but same kind of thing. If you like exploring that kind of sci-fi horror atmosphere and defending yourself against gruesome monsters, and you like showcases of good graphics, I would recommend it on sale, because I did have a good time with it, and I do think it gets harsher reviews than it maybe deserves, but that probably comes from the high expectations that everyone had at the time. But yeah, not a bad game, but not a great game either. I did enjoy it though. And next was another great survival horror game, Resident Evil 4. This was the 2024 remake, and much like the original, it is one of the best survival horror games of all time, and a great action game as well. And there's not really much I need to say about it. Most people are familiar with Resident Evil 4, and this is just a better version of it, with better graphics and gameplay upgrades and so on. I'll always have a soft spot for the original, because it was the original, but this was a great time, and it did a fantastic job making RE4 feel modern again. So yeah, if you like Resident Evil 4 and you haven't played the new version, absolutely play it. 100%. Great game. Next, I played Yakuza Kiwami, and this is a remake of the original Yakuza game in the same engine as Yakuza 0. And I played through all of Yakuza 0 a few years back, and have played some of Yakuza Like a Dragon, but I wanted to start going through the series in order, and started with Yakuza Kiwami. And I haven't finished it yet. I'm about halfway through, but it's a pretty good game. It's just another Yakuza game, almost like a miniature open world, a little bit like a miniature Grand Theft Auto in a way, without the vehicles, but you are running around doing crime stuff and solving missions for people. But yeah, the Yakuza games are kind of a buffet of a video game, where you have so many different things you can do, and they're all pretty good. Like, nothing is mind-blowing about it, but it's just a good time. You get to sit back and relax and do crimes and beat people up and all that, but there's also a pretty good story too. And the story in this one so far isn't as good as Zero, but it's good enough, and I understand that they do. Some games in the series are better than others, so Everhood Kiwami is not quite the greatest, but I'm still enjoying it. And though I haven't played it in a little while, I will be getting back to it, and hope to play the rest of the series at some point. Pretty good games, those Yakuza games. Next up, I played Master Detective Archives Rain Code, which is a new game from the creator of the Danganronpa games. And admittedly, I did not get too far in this game. I did play through the first few hours, and personally, I'm not really a fan of this one. In a lot of ways, it just feels kind of like Danganronpa, but worse. To me, I have heard that it gets better as you go on, but I haven't played too much of the game. Maybe I'll play more and change my mind, but the first few hours are not a very good impression, in my opinion. It basically is the same kind of murder mystery, puzzle-solving, detective gameplay as Danganronpa, but with more tedious elements to it, and more clunky, uninteresting gameplay, and less interesting characters at a slower pace, and to me it just feels like they took what wasn't broken and tried to fix it, and the results were not very good. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if I do play more of it, I'll like it, but my first few hours impression is not great. A bit disappointing, but oh well. Next, I played Everhood, which is a quirky little game that I would probably describe as a mix between Undertale and a rhythm game, but with a lot of trippiness added in. And that's pretty much the best way I can describe it. You kind of just roam around an interesting 2D world filled with characters trying to go on an adventure and solve problems for people, and it's kind of a mini RPG of sorts, but the battles are rhythm games where the enemies send out kind of glowing light blocks as attacks, and you have to dodge them in time with the music. And I thought this was a pretty good game. It's definitely trying very hard to be like Undertale, and in some ways it feels a bit unoriginal because of it. It feels like it's trying a little too hard, but it does a pretty good job of having that same kind of quirky style, and that makes it entertaining. But it also adds a lot of visual flair with lots of trippy sequences and crazy stuff happening on screen. And the combat is very fun once you get used to it, but it did take me a while to get used to the combat, because at first you think you're supposed to be dodging on beat with the music, but you're actually dodging attacks that come out of the enemy on beat. So there's a slight delay between the beat and when you push the buttons on the keyboard, unlike most rhythm games. So at first I felt like it was overly difficult, but once you get used to that, it's pretty intuitive. And it can become very addictive and satisfying to do these increasingly difficult challenges. And by the time you finish the game, you're going to wonder how you actually got through some of these battles, because they get very fast-paced and complicated. But if you like rhythm games and Undertale, I definitely recommend checking out Everhood. It was a very fun time, and I liked it. Next up, I played Tinykin. And Tinykin is a 3D platformer / collectathon type of game, where you are a tiny little person running around a world that is relatively giant, but it's like, human living spaces, a house. And then you're also trying to find and use an army of tiny little creatures called Tinykin. At first glance, it looks almost like a Pikmin clone, but it's really not that at all. the creatures are more of like a currency or an item that you get to use to solve puzzles as you throw them at things and have them move items around. And yeah, if you like collectathon games where you're just running around getting a bunch of items and trying to make numbers go up and complete 3D levels where you have to find all the stuff, I would highly recommend Tinykin because I found it very fun and addictive. It's fast-paced, it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's just a highly concentrated burst of running around, jumping off platforms, and collecting shiny little trinkets. So, Tinykin was a very fun time in my opinion, and I would recommend it for sure. Next up, I played Happy's Humble Burger Farm. And Happy's Humble Burger Farm is a pretty unique horror video game where you are a fast food worker. You live in a kind of sketchy apartment in a weird city, and every day you go to your job at the fast food restaurant and make food and work the register and all that. But things are not quite what they seem. And without getting into too many spoilers, it is basically a horror game where you try and run a fast food restaurant while being interrupted by creepy, scary, weird things. And if you fail to make your fast food quickly enough, you will be attacked and killed, and so on. And it's got an interesting vibe to it. It's kind of creepy. It's not terribly scary, but I thought it was fun to try and optimize my fast food making and survive as long as I could. And it has a story and a world to explore and lots of secrets to find, and I thought some of that was pretty interesting. But I'd say maybe 3/4 of the way through the game I kind of lost interest in it. I'm not entirely sure why, but I guess some parts of the game felt maybe a little tedious and repetitive, and maybe I was just getting tired of it. I might go back to it and finish it at some point, but it was a pretty good effort. I thought it was a decent game from what I played, and if you like horror games and unique approaches to horror, I think it's worth a try. It's a pretty good game. Next up, I played The Quarry, or at least the first 3 or 4 hours of it. The Quarry is a newer game from the people who made Until Dawn, which I really liked many years back. And it's sort of a horror game where a lot of it is cutscenes and you're just kind of trying to decide what the characters say and do. It's like an interactive horror movie in a lot of ways. And while I liked Until Dawn a lot, I felt like this was just kind of a worse version of Until Dawn. It has a very similar feel in a lot of ways, where you're just controlling a group of teenagers trying to survive a horror movie, but I felt like the characters were less interesting and the horror is less immediately scary, I guess. I'm maybe 3 or 4 hours into the game and I've seen very little that I would call very scary, and I barely even know what's going on. I feel like too much of the game is focused on characters that they've not actually made interesting enough yet. Maybe I'm panning it too early, maybe I'm being unfair, I'm not sure. Because I do want to go back and finish it, but it's not making a very good impression on me in the first few hours. I do wish it was better than it is, but it does have very good production values. It looks great, and I admire what they're trying to do. I just wish I liked it more, unfortunately. Next was Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and this is the latest 2D Mario game, and I think it is one of the best in recent years. Probably the best one since Super Mario World. And there's pretty high praise coming from me, because personally I was never a fan of the new Super Mario Bros. Series. Those games to me felt so bland and like there was not much of a style to them. They felt very sterile, like they were playing it too safe with the level design and art and everything. this game is like they took all the creativity that they saved up instead of using for those games and put it into this one. This game is still at its core a 2D Mario game, and it doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it has so many fun little creative elements to it, so many unique levels and gameplay things going on, that it's just a very fun time. And every level is different than the last, and it has a great art style that's still obviously 2D Mario, but it has a lot more personality to it, so it makes it a lot more fun to look at. And I like all the wonder flowers that you get in pretty much every level that transform things and make some crazy twist gameplay mechanic come up. It's just a great way to guarantee a fun time. And though I'm sure the novelty will wear off on repeat playthroughs, I think it's a very fun Mario game. And if you're going to play a modern 2D Mario game, Super Mario Bros. Wonder is the one to play. A great time. Next up, I played Suika Game, or Watermelon Game, as it's called in English. And this is a very simple, but a very addictive puzzle game on the Switch, where you drop fruits into a container and try and combine similar fruits to make bigger ones until you run out of space. And what can I say? You've probably heard of this game. It is super addictive. And one of those games that makes you waste hours and hours while thinking, why am I wasting so many hours playing this stupid game? But it is undeniably addictive and a fun time, and surprisingly difficult as well. I've still not managed to pass the 3,000 point mark that a lot of people say is their goal for beating the game, but even still, it's a fun time to sit down for a few minutes and play some Suika Game. So I would recommend it if you like simple, mindless time wasters. Though I guess I wouldn't call it mindless, because it does take some thought to determine where to drop the fruit, but I don't think very hard. Maybe that's why I haven't gotten 3,000 points yet, but you get the idea. Next up, I played Iron Lung, which is a somewhat recent horror game. It is a small indie horror game made by the developer of Dusk, if you're familiar with that first-person shooter. And Iron Lung, to me, is a game with a cool vibe, a cool atmosphere, and a cool concept, but I didn't really enjoy playing it, unfortunately. It is a game where you are locked inside a submarine, inside an ocean of blood on another planet, and forced to navigate the blood ocean with no windows, not even a live view of what's outside. All you have is a radar that tells you things are too close to you, and a camera that can take pictures that get slowly developed. And so you're just trying to explore this blood ocean and investigate all the artifacts or other items on a list that you've been given with their coordinates. And this sounds cool in concept, but in reality it is, to me, a game where you kind of just tediously push buttons to slowly make a submarine move around before occasionally taking a picture, and sometimes you'll see a creepy thing on the photo and that's about it. Sometimes you'll hear a creepy sound, but it is mostly looking at a map, clicking a button to go a few units along the grid, then looking at the map again, clicking a button to move a little further, looking at the map again, clicking a button to move a little further, and then 5 or 10 minutes later you hear a weird creaking sound or a groan, and then you repeat the process. So to me it got kind of tedious and boring, but if you like the idea, it might be worth a try. It's a pretty cheap game and a lot of people do like it, so you might like it more than I did, but I just the novelty wore off very quickly for me, unfortunately. But I do respect it. It is a cool idea. Just wasn't quite for me. Next, I played a game that my latest video was based on, God of War Ragnarok. And this is one that I didn't play when it came out in 2022 because I was waiting for a price drop. But yeah, it is the latest God of War game, and you're probably familiar with the God of War games. My feelings on this game, though, are pretty mixed. I really enjoyed the last God of War game, the one that came out in 2018, I think. I thought it was a great adventure game with a great story and fun combat and great production values. In a lot of ways, this game also has some of that. It has great production values and at times an interesting story and all that, but to me it felt unfortunately a little too bloated and unfocused. The story feels like it has some of the weirdest pacing I've seen in a game in a long time, where sometimes it moves way too fast through the important bits, and sometimes it moves way too slow through the uninteresting bits. And it feels like they tried to fit so many different little plot lines and characters in here, many of which felt kind of unnecessary and like they didn't really go anywhere, that at times I felt like the game was wasting my time, and it really tested my patience. A few times I almost stopped playing the game because I just did not care about what was going on, or that much about the combat that was happening between the stuff I didn't care about, because while the combat is pretty good, I feel like there are maybe too many combat encounters in here for how long the game is, and not enough about the combat changes as you go through the game. Even though you're unlocking new weapons and upgrades, you don't really feel like most of them are making a difference in combat, at least to me. Maybe that's something where you'd feel the difference more playing on hard mode, but I played at a standard difficulty, and for the most part I felt like I saw pretty much everything there is to the combat in the first few hours. So when I'd spend half an hour or 2 hours going through repetitive combat encounters and then seeing a 5-minute cutscene about a random character who isn't really that important to the overall story, in my opinion, it really just felt like I was wasting my time. But when this game is good, it really does have some great moments. I like certain bits of the story, even if I felt like some of them were rushed, and things like the interaction between Kratos and Atreus was at times very interesting and emotional. And so this is a game that I feel like had a lot of potential that was kind of squandered. It lived up to bits of it, but it was a bit too unfocused. If they'd really kind of tried to focus in on the most important characters and the most important bits of story and really give everything the proper amount of time to breathe without being interrupted by other less important stuff, it could have been a really, really strong game. But for me, it was just too mixed to really enjoy all that much. I'm glad I played it, but it was like maybe a 7 out of 10 at best for me. If you like the God of War games, I would recommend giving it a try, because a lot of people like it. You might like it more than I did. But ultimately, I'm glad I waited for a price drop. But still, pretty good. Just underwhelming for me, unfortunately. And the last game I played in 2023 was Dave the Diver, which you might have heard of because it's been very popular. And a lot of people seem to think it's an indie game. It's technically not, because it was made by a large company, but it does have the vibe of an indie game, where you go underwater to go fishing as a diver and find objects and so on in a procedurally generated ocean during the day, and then at night you make sushi from the fish you found and serve it at a restaurant for money. But there's a lot more to the game as well. There are tons of little gameplay elements and characters and storylines, and there's just so much going on in this game that it takes a concept that feels like it could be simple and repetitive and get boring after a couple hours, and is just constantly introducing new things to you. It has so much novelty to it that it never really gets boring, because you'll spend 10 minutes doing something, and then 10 minutes later something else, and 10 minutes later something you've never seen before, and it just keeps going and going and going with new stuff, and new rewards, new mini games, and gameplay options, and characters, and storylines. It's like they took the vibe of an indie game and stuffed it with as much content as they could, and I think that makes it a great time. I'm about 8 hours into it, and I do plan on continuing to play it, but I haven't seen everything yet. But at least that's how I feel about the game so far. It's just chock full of stuff. It is a great time to sit back and relax playing, though it does get pretty tense at times, especially if you run into a big old shark and you're not equipped to fight it. But, you know, if you've heard of Dave the Diver or it sounds interesting to you, I recommend it for sure. It's a very fun game, a great time. And that does it for the games I played in 2023. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'd like to thank you for watching.